In the quiet, barren world far from Earth, there was a small alien village that had seen better days. Once a thriving place, now it lay in ruins. The alien widow, named Zira, lived in a small shelter on the outskirts of the village, a place that barely kept out the harsh winds of the alien planet. Zira had been a proud member of a peaceful alien species, living in harmony with nature and her family. But that was before everything changed. Her husband, the love of her life, had been taken away in a tragic accident during a routine exploration of their neighboring planet. He was the one who protected their family, the one who kept their spirits high. Since his passing, Zira had found herself alone, struggling to care for their two children. Luna, a 5-year-old with a bright, curious mind, and Kale, a 7-year-old with a quiet, thoughtful demeanor. With her husband gone, Zira found it increasingly difficult to make ends meet. The alien village they lived in was suffering from a severe food shortage. Crops failed, and the remaining supplies were too expensive for someone in her position. The people who still lived there were either too ill or too old to work, and the younger generation had moved on to more prosperous places. Zira had no choice but to stay, trying to salvage what little remained. Despite her best efforts, her children were growing weaker each day. Luna had stopped asking for her favorite foods, instead asking for things she never needed before. Simple things, like a warm blanket or even just a smile from her mother. Kale, always the quiet one, seemed to understand the weight of their situation. He rarely spoke, but his eyes said it all. He was worried about his sister and his mother. One cold night, after trying to get some sleep with little success, Zira sat on the floor, her back against the cracked wall of the shelter. Luna and Kale slept soundly, their small bodies wrapped in tattered blankets. Zira's thoughts raced. What could she do to save them? How could she get them to safety, away from this world that was dying with every passing day? It was then that she heard the rumors. There was a human man who had come to their world, a man who lived alone in a small house far from the village. He was said to be kind-hearted, someone who had a reputation for helping those in need. Some called him a hermit, others whispered about the strange things he had done, but no one really knew much about him. The one thing that was clear, though, was that he had the means to help, and he lived in a world far different from their own. The human man had been traveling through their planet as part of an interstellar mission, seeking peace and understanding. Zira had heard his name only in passing, Jonah. The thought of approaching him seemed impossible. How could she, an alien widow with no status or resources, ask a human for help? But in the deepest part of her heart, she knew she had no other choice. She had to try. The next day, as the sun began to rise, Zira made her decision. She kissed her children's foreheads, promising them she would return. She left the shelter and started her journey toward the human man's dwelling. It wasn't an easy path. There were many obstacles along the way, including harsh terrain and a dense forest that seemed to grow more dangerous with each passing year. But she pressed on, her mind filled with hope and desperation. As she walked, Zira thought about her children. She thought about their laughter before the accident, their innocence before the world had turned so cold. They deserved better than this, better than what she could give them in this dying world. She wondered if Jonah would even listen to her, let alone help her. Still, she had to try. By the time Zira reached the edge of the human man's property, the sun had set. The house was a simple structure, but it stood tall against the alien sky, its windows glowing warmly. For a moment, she hesitated, fear creeping in. What if he turned her away? What if he did not care for her kind? But there was no time to waste. The children needed her, and she had to try. Zira approached the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She raised her hand and knocked, each knock louder than the last. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and there he was, Jonah. His face was kind but weary, his eyes filled with curiosity. He was an older man, not much younger than Zira, yet he carried an aura of strength, as though he had seen things others never would. "Can I help you?" Jonah asked, his voice soft but clear. His tone was not one of judgment or rejection, but of genuine concern. Zira's throat tightened, and for a moment, she could not speak. She had come all this way, but now that she stood before him, the weight of her desperation felt too much to bear. Her mind was flooded with thoughts of her children, of her struggle, and of her hopelessness. I need your help," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I have 2 children. We are hungry. We are cold. I have nothing left. Please, I beg you, help us." As her word hung in the air, Zira could feel the tears welling up in her eyes. This was it. She had no other options. She had placed her last hope in this stranger, a human, whose world was so different from her own. Would he turn her away, or would he hear her plea and offer her the help she so desperately needed? Zira stood at the door, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to steady her breath. She had traveled so far to reach the human's home, and now that she was standing before him, words seemed to escape her. The chill of the alien night surrounded her, but it was the coldness in her own heart that gripped her the most. Her children's faces, pale and gaunt from hunger, flashed in her mind, reminding her of the urgency of her request. Jonah, the human man who had answered her knock, stood silently for a moment. His eyes, filled with quiet curiosity, scanned her face. He seemed to be taking in the full weight of her appearance, the ragged clothes, the dust on her skin, the hollow sadness that clung to her like a heavy cloak. Zira's alien features were subtle, yet distinct, with sharp, otherworldly eyes and skin that shimmered faintly under the light. She knew her appearance might cause discomfort, especially in the presence of someone so different from herself. Jonah's expression softened as he studied her. He could see the desperation in her eyes, the weight of her unspoken fears. He stepped back slightly, opening the door wider, offering a silent invitation to enter. "Please come in," he said, his voice calm and gentle. "You're clearly in need. I'll make tea, and we can talk." Zira hesitated. She had never been invited into the home of a human before. Their worlds were so vastly different. Humans lived in cities of metal and stone, while her people had built homes that blended with nature. Still, her exhaustion and hunger made her decision for her. She stepped across the threshold, feeling the warmth of the room surround her immediately. Jonah led her to a small table where a pot of steaming tea sat, filling the air with the comforting aroma of herbs. As she sat down, her hands trembling slightly, Zira couldn't help but marvel at how ordinary his home seemed. It was a simple, humble space, but there was something soothing about it, something that felt safe. She had not felt safe in a long time. Jonah sat across from her, carefully pouring the tea into 2 mugs. He handed one to her, his movements steady, deliberate, as though he had done this many times before. Zira took the mug gratefully, feeling the heat seep into her cold hands. She took a sip, letting the warm liquid settle in her stomach, though it did little to ease the gnawing hunger. The silence between them was thick, and Zira struggled to find the right words. How could she ask a human for help? She was an alien, someone completely unknown to him, someone from a world so different. And yet, here she was, on the edge of her breaking point, asking him to take her in. She had nothing to offer him in return, only the chance to do something kind. Jonah, sensing her unease, spoke first. "You're far from your people, aren't you?" he asked softly. His voice was filled with quiet understanding, as if he had seen this kind of pain before. Zira nodded, feeling her throat tighten. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My home, my people, they are gone. I'm alone. I have 2 children. They are starving, and I am powerless to help them. Please, I beg of you. I need help. I've heard of your kindness. I've heard that you could help us. Please, take us in. Marry me. Make us your family. My children need you." The words hung heavily in the air. It wasn't easy for Zira to say them. It wasn't easy to place her fate in the hands of a stranger, someone who had no reason to help her. But she had no other choice. There was no one else left to turn to. She had spent nights crying, holding her children in her arms as they shivered from hunger and the bitter cold. Now, all her hopes rested on this one man, this human stranger. Jonah sat back in his chair, his brow furrowed. He took a moment to absorb what Zira had just said. His mind raced, torn between compassion and disbelief. Could he truly take in a stranger and her children, knowing that his life would change forever? And yet, the more he thought about it, the more he realized that what Zira was asking wasn't as impossible as it seemed. After all, he had spent so many years living alone, isolated from others. Perhaps it was time to embrace change. Zira waited anxiously for his response, her gaze fixed on the man who could either grant her this desperate wish or turn her away. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, as Jonah's mind weighed the gravity of the decision before him. Finally, Jonah spoke, his voice steady but unsure. "You want me to marry you, not just for you, but for your children too. You're asking me to take all of you into my life, into my home. That's a huge responsibility, and it's not something I can take lightly." Zira's heart sank. She knew this was too much to ask, but she had no other choice. She had put everything on the line. Her children's lives depended on this moment. "But," Jonah continued, his eyes locking with hers, "I can't ignore the truth that you and your children need help. I can't turn you away just because it's difficult. No one should have to live like this. No one should be forced to beg for survival." Zira blinked, not fully understanding what he was saying. Jonah smiled gently, leaning forward. "I can't promise a perfect life, but I'll do what I can. I'll help you. I'll help your children. We'll make it work. You don't have to beg anymore. You've already done enough by coming here." Tears welled in Zira's eyes, and she felt a deep sense of relief that she hadn't known in years. She had feared rejection, feared that no one would ever offer her help, that her family would continue to suffer. But here, in the presence of a human man, she found hope. Hope for the future. Hope for her children. She had taken a leap of faith, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like it had been worth it. Jonah stood up, extending his hand to her. "Let's start this journey together. You and your children are welcome here. This is where you belong now." Zira took his hand, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a beginning, a chance for a better future. The night had fallen deeper, and the small house, though humble, felt like a sanctuary. Jonah sat in his simple chair, his eyes fixed on the flickering light of a nearby fire. Zira, who had been sitting across from him, still had not fully processed his decision. Her mind was spinning, trying to wrap around the idea that the man she had just met was offering her a chance, a real chance at a future. But her heart still felt like it was in her throat. She had come here to beg, to plead for her children's lives. And now, she was faced with the overwhelming thought that this human stranger was not just offering assistance, but a life-altering promise. Zira's eyes drifted to the two sleeping children in the corner of the room. Luna and Kale were still wrapped in their worn blankets, their small, fragile bodies barely visible in the dim light. They looked peaceful for the first time in days, their faces free of the strain that had marked their lives for far too long. Zira's heart ached as she watched them. They had no idea what was going on, but she knew they needed something far more than what they had now. They needed hope. They needed a future, and Jonah had offered them that. Jonah had stepped into the kitchen, silently brewing another pot of tea, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. He had always lived alone, only briefly coming into contact with the villagers or travelers who passed by. His existence was simple. He had no family, no real ties to anyone. He had chosen solitude after a difficult past, thinking it would be the best way to heal from the wounds of his own life. But now, before him, was this woman, this alien widow who had walked across a hostile world to beg for his help, and her children, innocent, scared children who had no control over their fate. Jonah poured the tea into the mugs, the warm liquid filling the room with its comforting scent. He had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, on never needing anyone. And now he was faced with a decision that seemed far beyond his own ability to reason. Could he really take her in? Could he really offer this family, so different from his own, a life under his roof, his care? Was he prepared to make that commitment, knowing full well that it would forever change the course of his life? His eyes turned toward Zira, who was now sitting silently, her hands wrapped tightly around the mug of tea. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but she had a quiet strength about her. She wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. Jonah could see that. And in her eyes, he saw something that made his own resolve falter. She wasn't just asking for help. She was asking for the chance to give her children a life they deserved. Zira's voice broke the silence. "You don't have to do this. I understand if you don't want to. I just wanted to ask for the chance to protect them." Jonah turned, and their eyes met. He saw the sincerity in her gaze, the quiet desperation. But there was something else too, something in the way she held herself, in the way she had come all this distance without fear, that made Jonah question everything he had ever believed about his life. "No," Jonah said, his voice firm but kind. "You're right. I don't have to do this. But I want to. I'd spent too long hiding away from the world, thinking I could live without anyone. And now, here you are, someone who needs me, someone who needs help. I can't turn my back on that." Zira's breath caught, and for the first time, she allowed herself to truly relax. She had feared this moment, feared that Jonah would turn her away, just as she had been turned away by so many others. But now, she realized that her fears had been misplaced. Jonah wasn't just a man offering a home. He was offering her a chance at a real future, something that had seemed so out of reach for so long. Jonah continued, his voice growing softer. "I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to raise children, let alone take care of an entire family. But I do know this: I can't stand by and watch you suffer, or watch your children suffer. That's not the kind of man I want to be." The room was still, the only sound the crackling of the fire as the decision settled between them. Zira looked down at the mug in her hands, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. This wasn't just a gift, it was an offering of trust. Jonah was trusting her, just as much as she was trusting him. Zira stood up slowly, her knees trembling with the weight of the moment. She walked over to Jonah and took his hand in hers, holding it tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't know what this means to me, to us." Jonah nodded, his own throat tight as he saw the tears well in her eyes. He had expected to feel fear, uncertainty, maybe even regret, but instead he felt a surprising sense of clarity. This wasn't just about offering shelter to a stranger. It was about offering her and her children a chance to build something together, a family, a future. And as Zira stood before him, her hand holding his, Jonah knew there was no turning back. There was no easy way to undo this decision. But there was something about it that felt right, something that felt like it was meant to be. It wasn't just the right thing to do. It was the only thing he could do. Zira's eyes met his once more, and in that moment, both of them understood that their lives had irrevocably changed. They had crossed paths in a way neither of them could have anticipated, but it was a meeting that would shape both their futures forever. And as they stood there, together, the weight of their past slowly began to lift, replaced by the possibility of something new, something they had both longed for, but had never dared to dream could come true. And so, in the quiet of the alien night, Jonah made a choice that he would never regret. A choice to open his heart to the stranger before him, and to the two innocent children who would forever change the course of his life. The days that followed Jonah's decision were filled with quiet moments and new beginnings. The air of uncertainty that had hung over Zira and her children seemed to lift, replaced by something unexpected: hope. It wasn't an easy transition. Zira, though grateful, couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider. She had never imagined herself living in a human home, let alone being accepted into their life so freely. Yet, Jonah's kindness wasn't just a fleeting gesture. It was a promise, one that he intended to keep. The mornings were often quiet, with Zira attending to her children while Jonah went about his chores. She had learned quickly that the simple routines of this new life would be her foundation. The house was small, but it was warm, and the hearth in the corner filled the room with a comforting glow. For the first time in a long while, Zira found herself waking up without the constant weight of worry on her chest. Her children, Luna and Kale, had begun to play outside more, laughing as they explored the garden Jonah had started tending. It was a small victory, but it was everything to Zira. The children's laughter, something she thought she'd never hear again, brought tears to her eyes. One afternoon, as the sun was beginning to dip behind the distant hills, Zira sat in the kitchen, peeling vegetables. She had come to understand Jonah's way of life, a life built on simplicity, but also on respect for others. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic acts of heroism. It was about showing up when it mattered, making the quiet decisions that built a lasting trust. And in that, Zira had found more than just shelter. She had found a family. Jonah entered the kitchen, his face tired but calm from a day's work in the field. He had been busy building a small shed for their supplies, and his rough hands showed the wear of someone who had been laboring hard. Yet, despite the exhaustion that clouded his eyes, he always had a smile for Zira and her children. It was the kind of smile that said everything without words, a smile that told Zira she was no longer alone. "Zira," Jonah said, his voice breaking the quiet hum of the kitchen. "I've been thinking about what you said, the promise you made to your children. I know this life isn't what either of us expected, but I can see the strength in you. I can see how much you care for them, how much you're willing to do for them." Zira looked up from the vegetables, her hands stilling for a moment. She had known Jonah to be a man of few words, but when he spoke, it was with purpose. His words had the weight of someone who had seen the world in all its harshness and yet chosen kindness over indifference. "I know you don't owe us anything, Jonah," she said, her voice soft but steady. "But I'll never be able to repay you for what you've done. You've given us a chance I didn't think we'd ever have." Jonah stepped closer, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You don't need to repay me, Zira," he replied. "That's not what this is about. This is about what's right. We're both here because we were meant to cross paths. You've brought life back to this home. I've seen it in the way the kids laugh now, in the way you care for them. You've done more than just survive, Zira. You've found a way to live again, and that means something." The words settled over Zira like a warm blanket, comforting and reassuring. She had come to this place seeking help, but what she found was something she hadn't expected. She had found a partner, a man who not only understood her struggle but was willing to share the burden, not just for a time, but for as long as they both lived. She felt a swell of emotion rise within her chest, and without thinking, she turned and embraced Jonah. The hug was unexpected, but in that moment it felt right. It was a quiet moment of connection, a recognition of the bond they had forged out of necessity, but had transformed into something much deeper. Jonah, surprised at first, didn't pull away. Instead, he wrapped his arms around her, offering the comfort she so desperately needed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire, the gentle stir of the wind outside, and the soft breaths they shared in the stillness. Zira realized, with a clarity she had never had before, that this was what it felt like to be truly seen, not as a burden, not as a stranger, but as someone worthy of love and care. As they finally pulled away from each other, Zira wiped her eyes, embarrassed by the tears that had flowed so freely. Jonah smiled at her, a warmth in his eyes. "It's okay, Zira," he said gently. "You're safe here. You and your children are safe with me. No matter what comes, we'll face it together." The promise in his voice was more than words. It was an unspoken commitment, one that Zira could feel in her bones. This wasn't just a temporary arrangement. Jonah had made a choice, one that she knew he would honor, just as she would honor her own promise to him. They were in this together, no longer strangers, but a family bound not by blood, but by choice, by kindness, and by the shared understanding of what it meant to care for one another. The decision Jonah had made had been an unexpected one, but in the days that followed, it became clear to both of them that it had been the right choice. There was a new strength in their home now, a strength that came from the simple act of caring for one another, even when the world outside seemed so uncertain. Zira knew there would be challenges ahead. Nothing worth having ever came without sacrifice, but she also knew that, with Jonah by her side, they could face anything. And so, in the quiet of that alien night, the family that had been born from desperation, fear, and uncertainty found themselves united in hope. It wasn't the life they had expected, but it was a life they would create together. And in the end, that was all that mattered. They were no longer just survivors. They were living.